Welcome everyone to our briefing on the 2023 Teaching Excellence Framework. I hope you can all hear me fine and see me fine. We have excellent attendance today, so thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. Today we'll have a number of presentations and I'll ask my colleague to move on to the next slide so I can talk us through the agenda. Okay, brilliant. So we will have, in terms of the layout for today, we will have 4 presentations from OFS colleagues who will be introduced when they present. They will cover what the TEF is and why it's important to the OFS, how the TEF works, the provider and student submissions, the TEF panel and timings. We are also delighted to have 2 guest speakers with us today. Firstly, we will have reflections on the TEF from Professor Sir Chris Husbands. Chris has been the chair of the TEF panel since it first started and will also now lead the new TEF panel to make assessments for the 2023 exercise. We will also have reflections on student engagement from Callum Parry. Callum is a student representative on the TEF advisory group. In terms of the duration of today's briefing, we have until midday, but we hope to finish a little earlier. So I'd like to just cover off a few housekeeping points and also explain how the Q&A will work today. So this session is being recorded and will be made available on the OFS website shortly. We will also circulate a link to TEF contacts and TEF student contacts. Now, we'll be using the chat function to share links to additional information and further support as we go along in the presentation. So please have the box open and keep an eye on that. So in terms of the Q&A function, you can use this to talk to us. You can use it to submit general questions to us. We anticipate a large group of online attendees and can see that currently we've got close to about 350 attending, which is one of the largest attendances at an OFS briefing. Because of this, we will be running a managed rather than an open question and answer session at the end. We won't be answering questions that are very specific to individual circumstances, so please try to frame your question in a way that will be applicable to other attendees. If you do have a question that's only applicable to your provider, it's better to send us an email to tef@officeforstudents.org.uk. We'll also share that email address in the chat now. If you already have a general question in mind, please do post it in the Q&A now. It's best not to wait to submit questions until the actual Q&A session, as we have OFS colleagues working behind the scenes from the start to filter question up to the presenters. We are going to apologise in advance if we don't get to your question and we don't get to answer it. We are predicting a high number of questions. Again, the delegate numbers are coming close to 400 at the moment. But just to let you know that TEF contacts and TEF student contacts will have other opportunities to engage with us, and we will use the questions from today to frame those engagements. Okay. As you'll be aware that we did ask you to pre-submit some questions when registering for this event. And we have looked at also the common questions that have been coming into us via email, especially since we published the guidance. So we will look at addressing these questions in the presentations and in the Q&A at the end. Okay, brilliant. Before I move on to the next slide, it'd be great to understand who we have in the virtual room today, and if you've had the opportunity to view the TEF materials that we published recently. I'm going to ask my colleague Dawn to launch a couple of poll questions now. Brilliant, they've popped up on screen. You'll have about 30 seconds or so to respond, and then we'll all get to see the answers. So please go ahead. Okay, hopefully we'll close the poll now and we'll get to see the results. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for doing that. It's great to see that we have a good number of TEF provider and student contacts in the room. While this event is open to anyone in higher education with an interest in TEF, the purpose of today's briefing is primarily to provide useful information to these contacts, as they will be leading the TEF submission and the student submission for their provider. So welcome all, but lovely to see some TEF contacts in the room. Brilliant. Question 2, that's absolutely fantastic, considering we published materials a few weeks ago. We had hoped that the attendees would have had the opportunity to look at the indicators and read the guidance, and I'm really pleased to see that 87% of us have. Just to reassure you, if you haven't, this briefing will provide you with a good overview to get you going. We haven't assumed attendees have detailed prior knowledge of the test. Okay, thank you so much for engaging in the poll, guys. I'm going to ask my colleague to move on to the next slide, please. We also wanted to flag very early on that we will provide additional support because we are running a series of online drop-in Q&A sessions which start in November. These sessions will be dedicated either to TEF contacts or TEF student contacts or their alternatives. The confirmed dates are on the slide and we will circulate further dates shortly. These sessions will have a limited number of spaces initially, and if we find that demand is high, we will open up further sessions throughout the submission window. We will email invitations to these drop-in sessions to TEF provider and student contacts shortly. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this slide just recaps some of the points I've already mentioned. So the best way to get support in relation to provider-focused issues or queries is to email them through to our inbox, which is tef@officeforstudents.org.uk. That comes in directly to the TEF team. You can ask general questions today using the Q&A function. You've just seen a list of our drop-in sessions. Please do save the date until you get your invitation email. We'll share the dates of these in the chat, which I see my colleagues already done, as a reminder. I also want to flag that there are a number of events that sector groups are hosting over the coming months that OFS staff will be attending to talk about the TEF. You should get an invite to these directly from these sector groups. Finally, at the end of this briefing, we'll be emailing a short feedback form following the event. Please do complete it, as it helps us improve how we deliver these types of events. I will now hand over to Graham Rosenberg, Head of Compliance and Student Protection at OFS. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Ranjit, and we'll see you again later towards the end of this briefing. Next slide, please. I'm going to be just saying a few words about the overall purpose of the TEF. I think that's a good place to start. Why are we doing the TEF? Our overall aim as the Office for Students is to ensure that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. That, if you like, is our mission statement. Now, we have recently set out our strategy for the next few years about what we want to achieve over this period, and we are going to be focusing on two main areas: quality and standards and equality of opportunity. Now, these two are closely connected and mutually reinforcing. Improving equality of opportunity without ensuring quality and standards would not lead to positive outcomes for students. And likewise, ensuring quality and standards without improving equality of opportunity would mean that students who could benefit wouldn't. Next slide, please. So how does the TEF fit into our overall strategic aims? Well, it's a key part of our overall approach to regulating quality and standards. Through what we call the B conditions of registration, we set out high quality minimum requirements for quality and standards that all providers registered with the Office for Students must meet. And a lot of our work in the coming months and years will be to regulate to ensure compliance with those minimum requirements. But beyond these minimum requirements, universities and colleges are autonomous institutions and they're free to pursue excellence as they see fit. Now, the purpose of the TEF is to create an incentive for providers, whatever their own mission and their own context, to improve and to deliver excellence in their own way for their own students and the courses that they deliver. So we are incentivizing excellence above our minimum requirements through the TEF. And our theory for change, if you like, for how we think TEF will do that is that the ratings produced by the TEF create an incentive for providers. It influences their reputations and influences student choice. And for many reasons, providers and the people working within them will generally want to get the best rating they can. I also think that the inclusion of a student submission in the TEF this time round will strengthen opportunities for students to work with their providers to influence improvements in ways that really matter to students. Now, finally, we also intend that the TEF will reinforce our regulation of access and participation. And I'm sure you're aware that we're currently consulting on the future approach to access and participation plans. But we intend that it reinforces it by incentivizing providers to deliver excellence for all their groups of students, including, of course, underrepresented groups. Next slide, please. So, given that context, we've designed the TEF as a broad, principles-based framework that embraces and encourages diverse forms of excellence. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as you'll hear throughout today, through our guidance on the TEF, we try to be clear about the principles and the approach we take and set out broad criteria for excellence. But we don't try to set out very detailed or prescriptive guidance on exactly what evidence should be submitted, or indeed detailed set of rules about how the panel will make its judgments. We rely on the one hand, providers and their students to set out for themselves what they're aiming to do above our minimum requirements, and to set out in their own way how they know if they're succeeding in that. And on the other hand, we rely on a panel of experts, both academics and students, making expert judgments about how far a provider is delivering above the minimum requirements for its own students. So I hope that the guidance that we've published, as well as this session and other opportunities for Q&As, will help you to work out how the principles and the guidance will apply to your own situation and how best, therefore, to engage with the TEF. Now, the session today is specifically about the new exercise that will produce ratings in 2023. So a bit like the REF, we're calling it the TEF 2023. And when we publish the results from TEF 23, all existing TEF awards will expire. So any provider wishing to retain an award beyond 2023 would need to take part in this upcoming exercise. Now, for anyone interested in the background and how the TEF has evolved since it began in 2017, there's plenty of information on our website. This includes links to the original specification for the TEF that DFE produced, as well as the independent review that informed our thinking, and the consultations, the recent consultations and decisions we took, as well as, of course, the guidance for taking part in the exercise. And we'll hear a little bit about the background, I think, from our next speaker, who I'd now like to introduce, Professor Sir Chris Husbands, who chaired the original TEF panel and continues to chair through TEF 2023. Chris, I'm delighted that you could join us, and I look forward, as always, to what you have to say. Over to you, Chris.
Graham, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here with you. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this briefing. As Graham and Ranjit have both said, I chaired the original TEF panel. I'm delighted to have been asked to chair the panel that's responsible for making judgments under the revamped version of the TEF. For those of you who don't know me, my day job, I'm Vice Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam University. Sheffield Hallam, a very large, comprehensive and diverse university, which I suspect is dealing with many of the challenges that you are facing, whatever the nature of your institution. My task over the next few months is to lead the assessment panel to deliver a robust, reliable, efficient and fair set of judgments which ensure that what comes out, the judgments that you receive, that institutions receive at the end, meet the needs of students, of institutions and the public. And I just want to say a couple of words about each of those, because I think holding those overarching purposes in mind is helpful in guiding us through some of the detail that we're going to go through. We need to meet the needs of students to help inform choice, to help provide them with a clear map through what is an increasingly large and complex and diverse higher education landscape. But also, and as Shirley Pearce said in her review of the original TEF, to drive quality for students. I think we have to remember teaching excellence is fundamentally about students and about outcomes for students and the widest range of students that we recruit. It's important for institutions. Obviously, the outcomes are important for institutions, but one of the things that I've been very proud of since the TEF began is the extent to which preparing for the TEF and the TEF process has opened up questions within institutions about the drivers of quality, about equity for different groups of students, and about the ways in which right across institutions we work together to drive quality and outcomes for students. But the TEF is also important for the public and for that little subset of the public who attract so much of our attention, politicians, because it is important that we are demonstrating in an overt and coherent way that we take teaching quality and student outcomes seriously as a strategic issue across the sector. And one of the things I think the TEF has done for all institutions is to focus a lot of the work that was already going on in a more coherent and strategic way. So what we're doing is important for students, it's important for institutions, it's important for the public. For those of you who were involved in the first version of the TEF, you will see some familiar things, you will also see some new things. This has been redesigned. It's been redesigned based on our experience of running the TEF. It's particularly been redesigned on the basis of the advice that Shirley Pearce, in a very wide-ranging review of the operation of the TEF, conducted. And it's been redesigned on the basis of what is a shifted context. The world of 2023 is different from the world of 2017. I'll say one more sentence about that before I finish. All that means that we've learned a great deal. We've learned a great deal about the technical way in which the process can operate and should operate. We've learned about the relationships between metrics and qualitative evidence. We've learned about the relationship between provider perspectives and student perspectives. We've learned a lot about the ways in which central institutional initiatives interact with departmental, faculty, and college initiatives to shape student experience. And we've learned a huge amount about the ways in which we can exercise judgment across the sector. The views of the panel were critical in the first version of the TEF. They are further enhanced in the second version of the TEF. There is a longer institutional submission and there is a greater space for judgment, and it's therefore all the more important that the panel operates, as I say, in an open, transparent and fair way. I've not mentioned one absolutely overwhelming shift in context, which is the experience that we are all emerging from, the experience of pandemic restrictions that have had such a profound impact on student experience, student outcomes, institutional practices, and institutional processes. And I want to reassure you, all of you on this call, not just as the leader of an institution, but as somebody who observes higher education as thoughtfully and carefully as I possibly can. I and the panel will be deeply aware that the pandemic is not a little event sitting over there. It has been absolutely fundamental to the ways in which institutions work and have worked. It's part of the water in which we now swim across institutions, and we'll be aware of that and aware of its impact on short-term teaching and learning experience, but also on long-term teaching and learning strategies. So I'm enormously grateful to have the opportunity to chair the TEF again. It is a ringside seat on one of the most important and interesting sectors that I ever have to look at, the higher education sector. It is driven for me, the technical issues are absolutely vital, but for me it is driven by a profound moral purpose, a belief in excellence, a belief in equity, and a belief, as Graham's already said, that those two are intimately intertwined. Thanks very much for listening to me. I really do look forward to leading the TEF through the next few months. And I'm going to hand back to Graham.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to the next speaker, who is Rich Smith, who is the head of the TEF at Office for Students, and he's going to talk to us about how the TEF works. Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Graham. Hopefully you can see and hear me. Am I on the screen? Excellent. Okay, so thanks for that. As Graham says, my name is Richard Smith and I'm the head of the TEF at the Office for Students. And in my session, what I want to do is introduce the guidance documents to you and cover some of the specifics about how they work in practice. Now, we saw from the poll earlier that it's fantastic that so many of you have had a chance to read the relevant guidance documents already. So some of this will be familiar, but there were also a good proportion of colleagues out there for whom this will be the first kind of time they've seen some of this. What I'm going to do is really try and cover off the elements of those guidance documents that I think are most relevant to both students and TEF contacts. I'm not going to cover everything. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. So the two documents that we've recently published, you can see them there, and we're going to post some links in the chat to them. The first main document is what we call Regulatory Advice 22, Guidance on the Teaching Excellence Framework 2023. And this is a document that we really recommend is read by all providers who are either required to take part in the TEF or those that are thinking about taking part voluntarily. It's also a document that will be very important for the panel as they work through their assessments. And those of you that have had a chance to look will see that it covers topics including how the assessment framework is constructed. It includes things around the rules of participation and the scope of students that are involved or covered in the TEF. It also includes information on implementation, how to write submissions, information about indicators, and information about how the assessment process will work. So that's the first document. Now, we don't think it's essential that students read this document. Instead, what we've done is we've produced a separate guidance document for students on how to prepare TEF submissions. Now, because that document is really focused in on that task of producing student submissions, it doesn't include lots of the operational details. So if you are a student and you are particularly interested in all the full-blown detail of how the TEF will work, then you will need to have a look across to that main guidance document. And just before I get into some of the details, I just want to note the caveat on this slide, which is that nothing in this briefing can override that Regulatory Advice 22. That's the kind of definitive position on things. So we have made every effort today to make sure that the briefing is as accurate as possible, but in the event of any difference, that's the document that will apply. Okay, so next slide, please. So what are the outcomes of the TEF? Now, on this slide, you can see a bit of the new branding, the new logos that we're going to use for the TEF. And what I want to say here is that providers that take part in the TEF can get 3 ratings. There'll be an overall rating that reflects the provider's whole performance. And in turn, that's underpinned by 2 further ratings, what we call aspect ratings. One is around the student experience and one is around the student outcomes. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. And the introduction of those two aspect ratings is one of those changes that Chris just mentioned between the previous TEF and this current TEF exercise. I should also say that the assessment is of undergraduate students, so all undergraduate students are in scope, and within the guidance document there's further information about how to handle and treat different types of undergraduate students. Some students are optionally within the scope, so you don't have to cover them within your submission, but you can do if you choose so. So what you can see on this slide too is that there are 4 categories of outcome. Gold, silver and bronze, which will feel familiar to you from previous TEF exercises if you've seen those. And the basic rubric there is that the more excellence that a panel can identify, the higher the rating is likely to be. However, if the panel finds that there is an absence of excellence in the evidence that they're considering, they do have the option to not award a rating. And in this scenario, the outcome will be a requires improvement outcome. And you can see that logo on the right of the screen there. And that is a new feature that's been introduced to the TEF following our recent consultation. And then the bottom logo there is how we would present those different ratings together. The last thing I want to say on this slide is that following the TEF 2023 exercise, the plan is to run the TEF every 4 years. So once ratings have been given to providers, they'll normally last for that long too, 4 years. Although there are some ongoing eligibility requirements, again, which are set out in the guidance. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So what does the TEF assess? So I've already mentioned that there are 2 aspects, the student experience aspect and the student outcomes aspect. And the TEF assessment focuses on these 2 areas, as this is where we want to create those incentives that Graham talked about, where we want to create them for providers to improve. So as Graham mentioned, we have a theory of change, which is that the ratings, the exercise as a whole, will create incentives, reputational incentives providers, and hopefully they'll respond in ways that will enhance those areas, make enhancements and improvements around the student experience and student outcomes. Now, in broad terms, the student experience aspect focuses on teaching, learning, assessment, and the educational environment. And the student outcomes aspect looks at the extent to which students over their time in higher education and beyond have positive outcomes. It also looks at educational gains, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a few slides' time. Now, in our guidance, we break things down a bit further. So, for example, the student experience is broken down into 2 sets of what we call features of excellence. There's a set that relates to the academic experience and assessment, and then another set for resources, support, and student engagement. Now, as Graham mentioned at the start, the TEF is seeking to incentivise improvement above our minimum quality requirements. And this is because TEF is part of our wider approach to regulating quality in the higher education sector. He's already mentioned that we have conditions of registration known as the B conditions. And what this diagram also illustrates is how we have sought to build the TEF aspects above those minimum quality requirements. So, for example, we have a condition of registration B1, which focuses on academic experience, and we have a condition B4, which is concerned with assessment and awards. And you can see how there's a corresponding series of features about academic experience and assessment within the TEF. And on the next slide, I'll just go into some examples around those features. But to wrap this slide up, and actually this responds to some comments that I'm already seeing in the chat, it's really worth saying that for providers and panelists, actually, we think it's helpful for you to consider the guidance that's associated with those conditions of registration, because it will help you to understand how we're pitching the high quality baseline that Graham described, and then excellence above that baseline. So we are going to post up in the chat a link to how you can get to further information about our quality conditions. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of our features of excellence. I've used again here the academic experience and assessment features. And in the guidance, we set out in more detail actually how to differentiate different levels of excellence in relation to these features. And some of the ways that we differentiate between different levels of excellence include, for example, the extent to which the provider's approaches are really well tailored to its students, how effective those approaches are, and the extent to which they're embedded across the provider. So the more of those things that are apparent, the more likely it is that we will consider that, or the panel will consider that to be high level of excellence. There's a few points further I want to make about the features. We've deliberately defined them in quite broad terms, and that links it back again to what Graham was saying about wanting to have a TEF exercise which really speaks to the diversity of the sector. We've articulated these features in a way that we think can be relevant to the diversity of provision and different providers in the sector. The features also really focus on positive impacts and outcomes, less so than processes, policies and practice. I've been quite careful to do this. Again, what we don't want to do is to be very prescriptive about how providers go about things. We want providers to pursue excellence as they fit, because this is an autonomous higher education sector, as Graham mentioned in his remarks. So just in summary about the aspects and features, in summary, the panel will be looking for excellence in the student experience and outcomes, but within the context of each provider's own mission and mix of students and courses. If we could move on to the next slide, please. One thing I wanted to just bring out here is educational gains. This is an area that we've had lots of questions about, and a part of the framework which is quite different to how the previous TEF worked. Now, what I want to say is that we've taken a developmental approach actually that we think could further develop in future TEF exercises. And this is because we recognise that there's currently no national definition or measure of educational gains. But what we do think is that at this point in time, it's reasonable that providers should be able to articulate clearly what it intends its students to achieve with reference to a specific character and mission. We do think that providers should be able to describe in ways that go beyond measures of continuation, completion and progression what their students will achieve. And there we're thinking about things like personal, academic development and how well prepared students are for the world of work following their educational experience. We also think that it's reasonable that providers should know how it wants to support students to achieve these gains. But we do ultimately recognise that there are challenges in measuring it. So for this exercise, the way this is going to work is that if a provider can provide good evidence of educational gains, that would be considered positively by the panel. But at this stage, as long as a provider can articulate the gains it intends to deliver and has a credible approach for how it wants its students to achieve that, then an absence of really developed measures of educational gain won't on its own prevent a higher TEF rating. Okay, that's educational gains. The next thing I want to talk about is evidence. There are three main sources of evidence: provider and student submissions, and as mentioned already, providers will be setting out in their submissions their own narrative about how they aim to deliver excellence and how they know they're succeeding. And we do think it's a really positive introduction to this exercise around having student submissions. We think that increases the importance of working in partnership with students to deliver excellence. And one of my colleagues, Jack, will say a little bit more about the content of submissions in just a moment. The other evidence source is TEF indicators. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. What I'm going to do today is just quickly let you know the things that indicators cover. I'm not going to go into huge detail about them. We often find that the things that providers want to know about indicators and the questions that they have are very specific to their own individual circumstances. So I'm just going to say at the outset that what we do recommend is that if there's something that you want to know that is specific about your indicators, we do have a help desk, and the email address for that is going to be posted in the chat shortly. So I'm just going to cover things at a relatively high level. In terms of the student experience aspect, we have 5 indicators that are constructed from groups of NSS questions. Now, these are the indicators that we think align best with the features of excellence that I described earlier. However, if you wish to use other NSS data, you can, and there is guidance about how to go about that in Regulatory Advice 22. On the student outcomes side, we look at whether there are positive outcomes in terms of continuation, completion and progression. And on the continuation and completion measures, we look at where students are after a period of time, and we do define that separately for both part-time and full-time cohorts, recognizing their different study patterns. In terms of progression, we look at responses to the graduate outcomes survey, and we look at the data 15 months after your students have qualified to understand their labour market and other destinations there. So that's the basket of indicators that you will have available to you. I do hope that we can post a link up to where you can access those data dashboards in the chat. The key points I'd like to make about the indicators is that we use benchmarking in the TEF to understand performance. So we do look at how a provider has performed in terms of its mix of students and courses, and the benchmarks allow us to understand that relative to the performance of similar types of students on similar types of courses in the higher education sector as a whole. The other really important thing to note about our indicators is that we've been very careful in this exercise to present the data in a way that users of the indicators can take into account the statistical uncertainty that may be inherent in the data that they're looking at. That's very important. It will allow a much more nuanced assessment of the indicators and will enable that kind of tensioning of the indicators against the provider and student submissions to be more robust. Now, the TEF guidance includes summary detail of how the indicators are constructed. So it includes information on which students are in the indicators, the cohorts that are covered, includes detail of how the indicators are broken down into specific groups so that you can understand specific student characteristics or the performance of specific subject areas. It also provides summary detail about the factors that we consider when constructing the benchmarks. But for users that need much more detail around that, we do have detailed documentation and information on our website around the definitions and descriptions of these measures. And again, we'll post a link to that up in the chat. The last thing I want to say in this portion of the presentation is that the OFS has also produced some supporting data, what we call the size and shape of provision data. And this, again, we'll post a link up in the chat. This data can be used by the panel to understand the context that the provider operates in. It includes information about the numbers of students, the types of students, and the student and the courses those students are on. A bit later on, I'm going to say a bit more about assessment and the timeline, but for now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Jack, to talk a bit more about the provider and student submissions.
Thanks very much, Rich. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk briefly about the provider and student submissions and what should go into them. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So participating providers need to make a written submission by the 24th of January deadline. It can be up to 25 pages long, and this is broadly what it should cover. We've provided a recommended template alongside the TEF guidance, and a link to that template will be posted into the chat now. It's optional to use the template, but essentially it suggests that you use 4 sections set out on the slide. And this is what all providers really need to make sure that they cover somewhere. So the first section is provider context. This is important because the TEF panel's assessment is contextual. They're trying to find out how far you deliver excellence for your specific mix of students and courses. So you should use this section to describe those students and courses and how that relates to what you're trying to achieve as a provider. Sections 2 and 3 on student experience and student outcomes are each focused on one of the 2 aspects that you'll be assessed on. This is the real meat of the submission and where you should focus the bulk of your attention and your evidence. A new requirement for TEF 2023 is that provider submissions need to include a list of references to key sources of evidence that they've drawn upon. So we've suggested that this is included in section 4. This is all about ensuring that any claims made by a provider in its submission are backed up by real evidence. Now, these references aren't something that the TEF panel will be looking at in making their judgments. Rather, it's something OFS officers will do some spot checks on after the submission window closes in relation to a random sample of submissions. So we're calling this the verification process. There's more details about the verification process in our guidance, but just to bear in mind that we expect you to include a list of references, and we might get in touch with you after the submission window closes to ask you to provide documents or to ask you for more information about them. Next slide, please. So in terms of the evidence for sections 2 and 3, there are broadly 2 things to include. Firstly, your own internal evidence determined by yourself, and then evidence which tries to supplement the TEF indicators. And I'll speak briefly about both. In terms of your own evidence, we deliberately haven't been very prescriptive, but a general principle in considering what to include would be to think about the things that you use internally to know whether or not you are doing a good job and to draw on those. We included a non-exhaustive list of examples in the guidance. It includes things like internal monitoring and evaluation, internal data, external assessments that you might have had to go through. But we fully expect providers to come up with different and more examples of their own that are suitable to their own context. The other category of evidence, things that you might want to include in response to the indicators. This might be where you want to provide additional information to fill the gaps, maybe because some of your indicator data isn't reportable, or because you have lots of students on the types of courses that aren't covered by indicators. Or alternatively, you might want to comment on the indicators to explain reasons for past performance that were beyond your control specifically. So this might be things like if you think a particular indicator doesn't work particularly well for your students because of the quite specific outcomes that they go on to achieve, you can use, that's something you can comment on in the submission and the panel will take into account. Next slide, please. So on the student side, we want every participating provider to nominate a student contact, and then that student contact can choose whether or not to write a student submission. That student submission can be up to 10 pages long. We've also provided a template that kind of maps the format you can see on screen, includes these 3 sections. Again, the template was published alongside the student guidance, and hopefully someone can post a link. Yes, I see it's already in the chat now. Thank you. Students can also choose to make a submission in a non-written format, a podcast or a video, but we'd still recommend covering this content within it. So just to run through the sections, firstly is approach to evidence gathering. So this is important for giving the panel a sense of where your evidence has come from and how representative it is of all of your students, which will allow them to place more weight on it. So note that we aren't asking students to include a reference section in the same way that we are asking providers to. We will only very exceptionally get in touch with students to try and undertake verification checks with students. Instead, this first section is the part of the submission that will give panelists confidence that the views you are sharing in your submission are more than just your own independent views or of 1 or 2 students, that you've tried to involve lots of students across your provider and how far you've managed to go in doing that. Then again, sections 2 and 3 relate to the 2 aspects being assessed. It's worth saying the focus of the student submission is slightly different to that of the provider submission. We're asking students to provide student perspectives on the different aspects and the features that underlie them. So while providers are trying to give us evidence that demonstrates very high or outstanding quality, students aren't necessarily trying to demonstrate those levels. They're just focusing on demonstrating what the students' views are about those different aspects and features. Next slide, please. So when drawing on evidence about student perspectives, a few things to consider. We expect the level of evidence available to different student contacts to be quite varied, depending on the sort of support they have at their provider. So although we've made some suggestions in the guidance, we appreciate it'll depend quite heavily on what your situation is. You should collect evidence in a way that suits you and the level of support that you've got. But generally, draw on pre-existing evidence where you can. If you have a system of student representatives, definitely speak to them and try and gather their feedback if that isn't something that you already systematically do. If you're supported by a Students' Union or Students' Guild, you can draw on any research they've done historically to collect student views that relate to the features of excellence. Depending on what you already have available to you and what it covers, you might want to organise some additional evidence gathering that is just for TEF, although this isn't mandatory. In the guidance, we've made some suggestions about the sorts of things like surveys or focus groups that you could organise to gather extra evidence for TEF if you want to. Unlike providers, we don't expect students to provide a detailed commentary on the indicators, but you might find the indicators useful as a way of helping to decide any areas where you want to focus your efforts for additional evidence gathering. Next slide, please. I won't go into the full detail of this. This might be one to review later. It just gives a summary of some of the main differences between the provider and student submissions. The first two lines of this table I've touched on already. It mentions things about the different page lengths, alternative formats, and the need for providers to give references. Just a few other things to flag in terms of differences further down. There are generally things where we've tried to set different expectations, where we recognise it might be a bit more difficult for students to gather some of the same evidence. So one area in the third line is about outcomes achieved by graduates. So both submissions should cover the same aspects and features of excellence, but whereas providers are expected to talk about the outcomes they've achieved for past students, we wanted to recognise this sort of information might be a bit difficult for student contacts to gather. So students can choose to focus entirely on current students if they want, that's fine. Similarly, providers are expected to cover the last 4 years in their evidence, but we recognised students might find this difficult to draw on historical information, particularly if they're gathering evidence from scratch. So it's fine for students to focus on the views of current students if they want. And just the last line is in relation to kind of partnership provision. Providers are expected to cover this sort of thing in their submissions. So particularly where students they register are taught by someone else, often a university working with a partner college who actually does the teaching. But again, we thought this might be harder for students to cover, so they don't have to if they don't want. There's lots more on all of this in the guidance. Next slide, please. Okay, my last slide just sets out some of our expectations about how providers and students should work together on TEF. So firstly, we've tried to set an expectation that providers should support their students, and this might be by making sure they have access to data, making sure they know who to contact in their provider if they have any queries, maybe extending training opportunities that they're giving to staff to students as well. And as a minimum, we'd expect providers to have to help students explain things I was just mentioning about partnership provision that might not be immediately obvious to students, so that they know what is being covered in the provider submission and they can make choices about whether to cover it or not as well. Next, we've said the student submission should be independent. So it needs to be coordinated, if not directly produced by a student, not a member of staff. Providers should not try and influence their students to include certain content or exclude certain content either. So we talk a bit in the guidance about exerting undue influence, which might involve as well trying to influence them to do a submission or not do a submission, or putting pressure on them to share drafts in advance. Both of these things are ultimately up to the student. They don't have to do either if they don't want to. Students should have the final say over the content that ends up in their submission. And we've encouraged students to use the first section of their submission to tell us a bit about how they feel they've been supported, whether they've been allowed to create their content independently. And if they don't choose to submit, we plan to get in touch and just check whether they've been given opportunities to contribute to the process in other ways. But independence doesn't mean you can't collaborate, and where both parties are happy to do so, we would encourage collaboration. Things like arranging meetings, raising queries, discussing how you intend to approach certain sections, like maybe educational gains, sharing of drafts, they're all completely fine as long as both parties are happy to do so, and probably represent a good model for working together on TEF. On that note, then, I want to introduce another guest speaker who can talk about his experience of doing exactly this sort of thing. Callum Perry is currently a postgraduate student at UEA and has been involved in this sort of activity in the past as an undergraduate, and is also a student member of our TEF advisory group who have been steering the development of TEF over the last few years. So Callum, if you want to turn on your microphone and camera, I'll hand over to you for your reflections on the student submission and your own experiences working with your provider.
Thanks, Jack, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you this morning virtually. As Jack mentioned, my name is Callum. I am a former TEF student panel member for the TEF advisory group, and I've been working with OFS colleagues over the past few years during the period of consultation for the new TEF and of the implementation and period of guidance for student submission holders. And so I've worked with colleagues across the last few years and I've been working with colleagues in the sector, and particularly more recently to talk to them a little bit about some of their concerns, as well as kind of presenting to them some of the practicalities and ideas about how they might go about producing a independent submission. So what I want to do very briefly in this time today with you is to talk a little bit more about the reasoning as to why I think an independent student submission is really important, some of the challenges and the reminders that have kind of come through from sector colleagues about some of the challenges they might be facing, and maybe some of the solutions to those challenges, as well as some of the practicalities around starting to structure and plan your student submission. I should just mention that I've worked with OFS in my capacity as an undergraduate education officer in 2019 to 2021 on their access and participation plan student submission. So I've had an experience of how an independent student submission works in an institution. And so I'd like to think that I've got some experiences and reflections on some of the barriers that might occur, some of the misconceptions that might come about thinking about a student submission, and how to maybe tackle them. Firstly, just wanted to really touch upon some of the reasoning for why I think the independent student submission is so important. I think it's a great way to help enhance how we know what we know and how we build on the quality of what we know, as well as feeling confident in justifying those reasons and conclusions. And deeply ingrained into that reasoning is this what we call bedrock of student engagement, and that recently has been articulated in sort of pushing the boundaries of engagement further than just teaching and learning discussions, to more partnership and co-creation in policy making and evaluation, of which the independent student submission is a good example of that. And that really encourages students to engage in the purpose of why we do what we do and how we do it. And in my experience, there are three key ingredients to building that sort of engagement, which include the extent to which students feel they belong to the institution, and through their opportunities to make meaningful and impactful change, how much they feel valued because of this, and through the actions of the institution, how much they feel trusted as a member of that community. So this contributes to what we would kind of describe now as a self-actualized form of student engagement, where we move away from this tokenistic form of being in the room where something happens, ticking a box that a representative is around the table, and actually being involved in student voice, which enhances the quality work in teaching and learning provision at a much deeper level. So all of you here today are part of that process of richer and more authentic student voice and engagement in things such as the Teaching Excellence Framework exercise. Just a couple of challenges and solutions to consider from some of the experiences and also from some of the conversations I've been having with sector colleagues over the last few years. One of the concerns that we have is around sort of sabbatical training and turnover, but also the fact that there might be student leaders that aren't familiar with student union structures, that might not be a sabbatical officer, that might be taking on this role in another student leader capacity. So my reflections really are that whilst the role of the officer changes, there are still opportunities to really move past these challenges. We need to start to see the student organisation as an institution in its own right that has its own inner workings, its own inner longevity planning. So with this in mind, the student leaders on the call today, you are the ones really driving the car, you're driving forward the student submission. But do also remember that there are a plethora of different colleagues in your guilds, associations, organisations that will have been working on building the structures around you to form really good representative and evaluatory methods. So the organisation is the car itself that you are driving, and I would really encourage you to think about how your own organisations that work with student representatives are going to support you in collating that evidence and documenting the student voices throughout the year, which can formulate your submission. For returning officers, it may also be that a set of leaders that might help you write the submission. So how have you already experienced the inner workings of your student organisation? How can you pull on different student staff or organisation leaders to help pull together the different areas that you want to cover in your submission? And you should also read the guidance really carefully that's been published, make a list of what's required, and using staff in your organisations that work with student leaders to really pull together a good picture of student voice and experiences across the university. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the practical strategies you can do to help that in a moment. We also need to be clearer on how student leaders are involved in quality assurance and train and adapt our structures accordingly. So please do make the most of these sessions that are on offer, as well as future sessions that will be on offer to yourselves, to really make the most of trying to really understand what your role is and how the student organisation can reflect on these exercises and change the training and the provision that's in place for future years to do TEF exercises. We also know that there's some concerns around maintaining independence, both from the university provider side and also from student leaders. So we just need to remind ourselves, I think, of what lots of sabbatical officers will be aware of, I'm sure, of this critical friend approach that's often referenced across the sector, particularly in student organisations. There should be autonomy and independence woven through the core of student voice and through the submission. But there should also be a real sense of strong partnership, which ensures the transparency for criticality. There shouldn't be lots and lots of surprises, and there shouldn't be lots of spaces for conflict. We want to see there be some partnership working to really support both sides of the submission to put forward the best and truest reflection of how student outcomes, educational gains are being achieved within the provider. And that does require, as Jack was mentioning a moment ago, things like trying to have meetings with your institution, thinking about how you might want to share particular sources of information and how you might come together to think about some of the key core messages that maintain similar narratives, but also where those maybe conflict and where you're going to talk about differences within student experiences and institution experiences. And the final challenge really that I would reflect on is about representative samples. So one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is that we know that it's very difficult to always understand all the voices of students, and how do you understand the voices of those that are underrepresented when they can sometimes be underrepresented in the spaces that you're collecting evidence from. So the initial focus should really be on the quality of what we're saying, rather necessarily sometimes in the quantity of those around the table. And of course, we want a diverse range of stakeholders at the table, but many of the ways to change this are down to each of your individual institutions to reflect on about how you empower underrepresented students and bring about diversity of voices in student leadership positions. So we need to think about how diverse and representative the evidence we have is and how it is being captured. So can there be opportunities for a team of students that are representative of the student population to support the submission and the student leader or the student officer Could there be a panel of representatives that create more diversity to check the draft as it's progressing? Could you set up a task and finish group with a set of student leaders and representatives from a cross-section of your university population that could be there to provide those minority and underrepresented voices, and also provide that diversity of perspectives? And finally, just really wanted to conclude on some of the practicalities around how you might sort of structure your time most effectively moving forward. One thing that I've been talking to colleagues across the sector about is the sort of 5 C's that I would suggest moving forward with. So one of them being collate. So collate the evidence that you think is really useful. What do you have already existing, as Jack mentioned? What structures do you have in place? What evaluatory methods and reports do you have in place that span the period of the submission window that you think would be useful? Can you then capture what this means for quality and what it says in relation to the areas of focus? And can you go out then and capture what you might not know? Can you find any gaps to fill? And can you really comment then on what the impact of that data is? What are the gaps suggesting? What's the data and the evidence base suggesting about the experiences of students in relation to the areas of submission? And then finally, you might want to complement or contrast those experiences with institutional data and narratives. So is there clarity that will make it clear as to whether there is synergy or conflict with the institution submission? Is what students are saying similar to what data and narratives are being put forward from the institution? Or is it that there's something different that you're finding? And that will require you to look through really carefully, perhaps at course representative meeting minutes. It might require you to look at wider societies and activities, groups to think about employability for educational gain, but really to get under the skin of some of the narratives that you are experiencing. And it's really important that you think about how you might prioritize some of those. So as an organization of student leaders and representatives, what are the key issues in relation to student outcomes and educational gains that you think should be put forward in your student submission? So I think that structure really helps to conclude the ways in which you might want to go about thinking about the submission as you move forward and engage with more of your students in your institution, but also engage with sessions like this hosted by OFS to think about how you might want to structure that. And I would encourage student leaders to really think about how they want to present that information, not just through a written narrative, but as has been expressed. Could it be through more audio? Could it be through podcasts, through more interactive forms of presentation to really showcase the diversity and the creativity of the student body that you come from? I will leave it there. That's a whistle-stop tour of some experiences and ideas of how to move forward. As always, happy to share my contact details if any of you would like to talk about anything specific to the student submissions. And I wish you all the best of luck in starting this. And thank you for your participation and dedication in trying to provide more authentic student voice to quality assurance in higher education. Thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Rich, I believe.
Yes, and thank you ever so much for that, Callum. That was fantastic. Really brought to life issues around purpose and some really useful practical tips and information there. And I'm sure lots of the people on the on the webinar may bite your hand off to get in touch for further advice. So thank you again for that. So I'm going to finish on a few slides around assessment and the timeline. If I could just have the next slide, please. And yes, let's actually go on to the next slide again. Thanks. So the assessment is conducted by the TEF panel. The TEF panel is an OFS committee that's responsible for deciding the ratings that we've already looked at. And as has been mentioned already, there are going to be academic and student members on that panel, and they'll have expertise in learning and teaching. And we're currently going through an open recruitment process for that. And it may be worth saying that we had a really fantastic response. We've had hundreds and hundreds of applications actually, well over 400 for applicant academic panel member positions, and over 100 for student panel member positions. And we're just still working through those, and we do expect to be appointing the panel and publishing that membership on our website in November. In terms of the size of that panel, we expect there to be about 40 academic members and 20 student members, plus an additional chair that's a student and another additional deputy chair that's sorry, let me just say that again. An additional deputy chair that's a student and an additional deputy chair that's an academic, and they'll be there to support Chris Husbands. We're really looking to get a good diversity across the panel in a number of ways. We want to have diversity represented on the panel in terms of different types of providers, and that's because we want there to be sufficiently broad expertise within the panel to understand the different and the wide-ranging educational context within the sector. And we also want the panel to reflect the diversity of the students whose experience and outcomes it's considering as well. I can see there's actually been a few questions asking about things like training. We will be training the panel members. They'll be using the guidance document that we have published already. And what we will be doing is one of the things that we'll be doing is carrying out a calibration exercise. What happens there is once providers have submitted their information and students have submitted their submissions too, we'll carry out an exercise where we look at a small sample of cases with the whole panel to really establish that they're applying that guidance in a really consistent way. As Chris mentioned in his remarks, it's incredibly important that the assessment is robust, reliable and fair, and we do build in quite a lot of mechanisms to ensure that happens. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So within the guidance in Regulatory Advice 22, we set out some underpinning principles and guidelines for how the panel should carry out its assessments, but we do really rely on their expertise to make judgments. And I just wanted to run through some of the principles, though, for the audience. The first is that the assessment should consider how far a provider delivers excellence for its mix of students and courses. Now, we've talked quite a lot about context today and providing data, for example, around context and including context in the provider submission so that the panel can really fully understand that and make a judgment about the context for a specific provider on a case-by-case basis. The next principle is around having positive evidence of excellence above the minimum quality requirements. It's worth saying that the starting point for assessments is that all courses should be high quality, and that's because to participate in the TEF in the first place, providers do need to satisfy those minimum requirements for quality as set out in the B conditions. So it's important that when you put your submissions and evidence together, that you articulate excellence above that, and that's what the panel will be looking for. Next assessment principle is that assessment should be based on balanced consideration of the sources of evidence. So we really want the different evidence to be tested against each other and weighted appropriately by the panel when making their overall judgments. It may well be that there are things like missing data or data that has lower statistical certainty. It may be that a student submission is not available, and the panel will really need to look at those issues and consider the evidence, consider the issues, and take a view on the weight of the different evidence that they have before them. We do say a number of things in our guidance about weighting, including that data can only form up to 50% of the evidence that's taken into account. But the broad point that I want to make is that we do really encourage the panel to weigh up evidence in a really nuanced way, rather than just taking a kind of tick box or prescriptive approach to looking at it. The next principle is that the ratings criteria should be applied holistically to all the evidence available. And what we're saying here is that we don't want the panel to approach things as a tick box exercise. We have set out different features of excellence, but we're not looking for the panel to kind of go, right, here's one feature, let's tick off the level of excellence against that. We're looking for a much more nuanced, holistic consideration of all the evidence across the aspect from the panel when they make their judgments. And the final principle here is that assessments and outcomes should be transparent. And one of the things here to say is that the panel, when it makes its decisions, will have to come up with a rationale for why it has decided to award a provider gold, silver, bronze, or requires improvement. And we will be looking to publish those panel statements. The other point here is around coherence. We do have some rules set out in the guidance to stop incoherent outcomes. For example, we don't want to see a situation where a provider could get 2 bronze aspect ratings, but then a gold overall. We have some rules to stop that kind of thing happening. So bearing all of that in mind, when the TEF panel looks at evidence in the provider submission, it's much more likely to find it compelling or place greater weight on it where it sees that it's directly relevant to the provider's mix of students and courses, where it sees that there's been positive impact demonstrated that relates to the provider's approach, and that the evidence in total covers all a provider's groups of students and courses that are in scope for assessment. In terms of the student submission, the panel will be considering the extent to which the evidence reflects the views of the students within the scope of the submission and is relevant to the features of excellence. Of course, we do need to remember that the key purpose of the student submission is to provide evidence of those student perspectives. And then the panel will also consider the provider's indicators. So they'll do that in relation to the benchmark that I mentioned earlier. And where they see that providers' indicators are materially above the benchmark, they'll consider that to indicate outstanding quality. Where indicators are broadly in line with the provider's benchmark, that indicates very high quality, and materially below the benchmark indicates not very high quality. What we see in some of the questions is that some people think that if you are above benchmark, that might automatically be considered as gold, or if you're on benchmark, that could be considered silver. That's not the way it's working in this TEF exercise. We look for differing levels of excellence in terms of very high quality and outstanding quality, and then we look at the overall kind of accumulation of that excellence when coming up with a gold, silver, or bronze rating. And if we could just move on to the next slide, please. The final thing I just want to say is around the timeline. So we're into the submissions phase now, and hopefully you'll be starting work on that and preparing submissions if you either need to submit or wish to submit voluntarily. The deadline is the 24th of January, so make sure that's in your calendars. We'll then move into an assessment phase, and the panel will do a large proportion of their work between February and June. In summer 2023, providers will receive the panel's provisional ratings, and providers may be happy with those, or they may wish to make representations about those provisional ratings, which they can do if they think the panel's judgment does not appropriately reflect the original evidence that was available to the panel, or if they find any factual inaccuracies in the panel statements. We'll then be publishing outcomes from September 2023, at which point providers can also promote their ratings if they wished. And then last thing, as I mentioned right at the start, the next TEF, we don't plan to run that for another 4 years, but we do expect to update and publish the indicators for providers in England annually. We'll also be doing things like conducting evaluation of this TEF exercise and understanding how we can make further improvements for the next exercise. And at that point, I would like to wrap up on that and hand back to Graham, please.
Thanks very much, Rich. And thanks to all of the presenters. We are going to move now to a Q&A session. Ranjit's going to come back and, on your behalf, ask a number of the questions that you've raised. We've had loads of questions and we just don't have the time to go through all of them. So Ranjit will pick out some of the most commonly asked questions and a panel of us will try to answer them. But I would just like to repeat what Ranjit was saying earlier, that we knew this would happen. So that's why we've arranged the drop-in Q&A sessions where we will just spend time answering questions without all of the presenting up front. So over to Ranjit now, if you'd like to please take us through some questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Graham. Just checking you can see me and hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, brilliant, Graham. So first question, which I'll direct to you, Graham, is somebody asked that my provider is eligible to take part voluntarily in TEF. How should I decide whether to take part? And especially if my dashboard's looking pretty blank.
Yes, a few questions like that. So there is some information in the guidance in the section on participation. I think we've sort of highlighted it in orange as a section of things to consider if you are a voluntary provider and are thinking about taking part. There are a number of points in there. I'll just mention a couple. Firstly, we only run the exercise once every 4 years, so it's now or in 4 years' time. So that's worth thinking about. It is worth thinking about what your indicators are looking like and how complete the data is, because the TEF panel is going to need to find evidence of excellence in order to award a TEF rating. So that information is going to need to come from a combination of what's in the indicators and in your submissions. If the indicators are very sparse, they will have to rely more heavily on what's in the submission to find evidence of excellence. So in a way, there's no guarantee that there will be a TEF rating if the TEF panel doesn't find that evidence of excellence. I think there have been some questions about fees. So if a provider doesn't take part, then clearly it wouldn't have a rating and couldn't have the inflationary fee uplift. If it does take part, it would need to get a gold, silver or bronze overall rating to have that fee uplift.
Great. Thanks, Graham, and thanks for bringing the fee element into it as well. I think there's a great answer to that question there. Okay, brilliant. My next question is for Jack. One of our delegates asked, the student submission is voluntary. How much weight does the student submission carry if submitted? And what if there isn't one? How will that affect my provider's assessment?
Okay, couple of questions. On kind of weighting of the student submission, it's worth saying there's no predetermined weight for the different pieces of evidence. That goes for the student submission and the indicators as well. The panels will weigh up the different pieces of evidence it has based on the strength of evidence they contain. So we're not saying automatically a student submission counts for a third. You know, a really strong submission could count more. A really poorly evidenced submission could count less. They'll take into account how well it's evidenced in weighing it up. So that's the answer to the weighting question. If a student chooses not to submit a submission, we absolutely recognise that some students just won't be able to do this. They won't have the support. This will just be maybe a step too far. And while we encourage them and want to support them, we can't design a system where we punish providers just because their students weren't able to make a submission. So the answer is there's no adverse effect if your student has made a free choice not to make a submission. However, we would in that case encourage you to involve your students in the provider submission instead, or make other opportunities available for students to contribute to the TEF process. There is an expectation that students are involved, and I guess the only caveat to saying there's no negative effects is unless we hear from the student, and we will ask them that they were not provided the opportunities to take part, that they didn't know they could, or you didn't nominate a student contact who could tell us that this was their own independent choice. So hopefully that answers those two.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Jack. And like you said, it's we really hope that students may want to kind of do the student submission. I'm actually going to stick with Jack for a second and ask a follow-up question. As the student contact, do I need to write all the content of the student submission? Can student union staff or others produce content with me or for me?
Okay, so the student contact doesn't individually need to doesn't need to individually write every single word. It's really important that the student contact takes responsibility for the final content so that they're happy with the final wording and what goes in there. But you should draw on the support of others that you've got, whether that's other students who are supporting you, or if you've got a students' union, students' association, draw on their support as well. I really liked Callum's analogy that the student should be driving the car, and I repeat that. I think there's always a risk that it goes too far. I think a situation where, you know, a students' union or someone else was trying to draft a student submission and just get the student to kind of tick box sign it off is kind of overstepping the mark. We really want students to be taking control and taking responsibility, but absolutely, like, draw on the support of others. It's a kind of coordinating role, and you don't have to do it all yourself.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks for that, Jack. And obviously there's support available from the OFS as well through the guidance drop-in and things like that as well. So brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to give Jack a break now, and I'll move on to Rich. Rich, a guidance question for you. So the guidance gives definitions for outstanding and very high quality. But the question is framed as there's no definition for high quality. So there is for very high quality, but not high quality. And high quality is referenced in the criteria for a bronze rating. What is the definition of high quality? Sorry, Rich, a slightly complex one there, but I hope you got it.
No, that's fine. So this goes back to understanding that TEF is part of a wider approach to quality that the OFS undertakes. So to register and stay registered with the OFS, as Graham kind of indicated earlier, providers must show that they offer high quality education through continuing to meet our conditions of registration. We see those conditions of registration maintaining high quality and high standards. So the answer, in short, is that high quality is defined through our conditions of registration, specifically sort of B1 through 4 in relation to how it relates to TEF. And that's actually why I mentioned earlier that providers will find it useful to look at the guidance associated with those conditions to kind of understand how to pitch things relative to that.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. Thanks, Rich. I'm going to stick with another guidance question for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the guidance defines materially above, materially below, and broadly in line with benchmarks. How do these relate to the quality levels? Does broadly in line with benchmark mean this would be seen as high quality or very high quality?
Yeah, so I realised actually I think I slightly stuttered as I was possibly explaining this one earlier. Okay. So where performance is broadly in line with benchmark, it should be interpreted in the context of a high performing sector, and we do set this out in our guidance. So we consider that above benchmark is outstanding, and in terms of on benchmark it is that high quality.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Sorry, they were two very complex questions there, and repeating the same.
Sorry, do you mind if I just jump in there?
It's
Sorry,
okay.
Rich, I think you were looking for the reference. So, sorry, broadly in line with benchmark would initially be interpreted as very high quality.
Yeah, no apologies.
You meant to say that, I know.
Sorry.
It's okay, Rich. I think it may also be the way I asked the question. There was a lot of qualities in just one sentence.
No, it's something that there's a lot of qualities, and it's one of the things that people do find difficult through the whole guidance. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, Graham, I'll come back to you and ask a question around the panel, if that's okay. So how will the TEF panel take account of a provider's data that's below the minimum B3 threshold? What if the benchmark itself is below the relevant B3 threshold? Should a provider, the provider's narrative approach, should they kind of explain their approach? And, yes. and it kind of, so basically I think it's a bit about how the panel will kind of take into consideration B3. I'll let you explain some of it and see if I can.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there are a few related questions about the relationship between the B3 thresholds and the benchmarked data and the assessment. So I think I'd just go back to the relationship between our overall approach to regulation and TEF. The TEF is looking for excellence for the provider's own mix of students and courses. So it is primarily, the panel will primarily be looking at the benchmarked performance in the indicators. The TEF panel won't actually be looking directly at B3 thresholds, and whether the sort of absolute performance is above or not the threshold. So they will be looking primarily at benchmark performance, and it is actually very rare that a provider's benchmark is below a B3 threshold. That's a very rare thing indeed, partly because of the way we've set the thresholds. So I would suggest that the provider submission should focus on the benchmark performance. Separately to that, we do look at assessing providers against B3 thresholds through our regulation. And where we carry out an assessment of a provider's compliance with condition B3 with student outcomes, if we do find a breach, at that point we will decide whether or not it's appropriate for a provider to retain or to have a TEF rating. But that's a separate regulatory decision, not something that the TEF panel itself will be looking at.
Okay, great. Thanks, Graham. Okay, I'm going to move on to some questions around framework and assessment, and direct them to you, Rich, if that's okay. So this is a good one. Can you please expand further on the distinction? Sorry, give me a second, Rich. Actually, I'm going to go for this one first. Please clarify how the evidence is weighed between the indicators and the submission, and what if there is limited or incomplete data, or the opposite side, no student submission?
Okay, so I said a few remarks about this earlier, which is that we do ask the panel to kind of look at weighting different evidence in different ways. They'll be looking at the strength of evidence when they come to weighting it. They're not taking a prescriptive approach and saying this is 1/3, this is half, this is a quarter. But we do set out within the guidance some particular things, and one is that the data should form no more than half of the evidence. Now, I think one of the things that might be underlying this question is how does that actually work? And within the guidance, we set out that it works in different ways for each aspect. So on the student experience side, we do have the NSS data, but what we are saying there is that we want the providers to supplement the information around the NSS in order to give a kind of full picture around the student experience aspect. Now, it works slightly different on the student outcomes side because we have kind of slightly harder measures: continuation, completion, progression. So on the student outcomes side, that half weighting applies more to the educational gain aspect of it. So you have half of the data on the student outcomes within those indicators, and we're looking for half again through educational gain. But of course, as I mentioned before, the actual weighting should be in proportion to the kind of evidence overall. You also asked, I think, about where there's limited or incomplete data.
Data, yeah, that's correct.
So yes, a couple of things to say here. Providers could either have entirely missing data, or they might have data where there's kind of less statistical certainty. So there's different ways in which data can be limited, and providers may want to treat that in different ways in their submissions. What the panel will want to do is look back over to those submissions to understand proportionally where there is missing data. They'll look more to the submission effectively to kind of fill those kind of different gaps. I think there was was there a third part to your question as well?
No student submission. So I think Jack covered that. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Rich. Actually, Rich, I'm going to just ask you one more, which I think is a really good question, and I think it's come up obviously not just today in emails to us, in other forums and student conferences that even I've attended this year. So the question is, can you please explain the distinction between education and the wider HE experience? For example, does the assessment cover student well-being, pastoral support or or extracurricular activities? So I think that question came up in a recent conference as well.
Okay, so we have sought to focus the scope on the educational experience rather than the wider student experience. So things to do with the social experience of higher education, social experience that students get kind of out of scope. Within the educational experience, we say a couple of things though. We do want it to include things that go beyond just the core curriculum. So we clearly state that we recognise things like career development, employability kind of sessions as kind of being in scope there. In terms of wider pastoral activities, what I would say here is they're not sort of directly in scope. We recognise that providers may want to talk about how these things contribute though to the educational experience. So where providers can say, yes, we do pastoral activities and we think it has a positive impact on the educational experience, then the onus is on them really to kind of demonstrate that link and talk about how it has an influence on the educational experience or indeed outcomes within the submission. So the onus is on the provider really to make those connections on those latter type of activities.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rich. And also, I think it's really important that Chris obviously talked about the impact of COVID as well. And we talk about that in our guidance as well. So that falls in that kind of student well-being and education and experience as well. So I'm glad we've covered that as well. Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to ask a few more questions. We'll go to about 11:40 if that's okay. These are all very important questions. So the next one, Jack, I'm just going to ask you a question around submissions. So how many references are you expecting in the provider submission? Are they part of the page limit?
Thanks. So yes, they are part of the page limit, and that's, I guess, part of the answer to the question. We've deliberately made it part of the page limit so that you police yourselves in how many references you include. We deliberately haven't set a limit because it kind of depends. It depends on what evidence sources you're drawing on, how they're set out, how streamlined you're able to be with your referencing. We've tried to set a general principle that you should reference the most important evidence sources that you've drawn on. So I guess bear in mind that it uses up your page limit and prioritize the ones that are most important. I can't really set an exact number. There probably is quite a wide range that is all okay. But if you find you're taking up several pages of your submission with references, you've probably gone too far. If you've written a 25-page submission and you only have 3 or 4 references, it's probably a bit thin. And somewhere in between there is a range of sweet spots that kind of depend on what evidence you're drawing on as a provider. So maybe a slightly unsatisfying answer, but I think you need to just prioritize and weigh it up against how much your submission content you want to include.
Great, thanks, Jack. The next couple of questions, I'm actually going to put them out there for all 3 of you and see who wants to answer this one. It's again, very good question. Please, can you clarify what you mean by the last 4 years? Is that from the time of writing the submission, calendar years, or academic years? What is the actual date to date period?
Should I jump in on that one? It's yeah, we're saying it's the last 4 academic years up until including 21-22. So there may be some particular cases where you might not have non-standard academic years, so use your judgment about that, but it's the last 4 academic years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Graham. Jack, you may want to pick this one up, but again, I'll open up to the room. About the student submission. So someone's asked, does the student submission need to cover the features of excellence? Because in the guidance, we do advise that it does, especially if the provider submission is already covering all of them. Isn't it just going to be repetition?
Thanks. So in my presentation, I said the provider and student submission cover the same features of excellence. So that just means kind of broadly, there's not a different set of rules for students as there is for providers. You know, we're all looking at the same thing. The TEF is assessing the same thing. The distinction I made in the slides was just to set some expectations around where it particularly might be more difficult for students to collect evidence around, you know, students that have left or historically. But the student submission is entirely optional. All of the features are optional. You don't have to tick off every single one. You can, I mean, especially if you're worrying about the size of this task or the evidence available to you, you're entirely welcome to focus on the ones where you have lots of evidence, the ones that are particularly important, you think, to your students or, you know, to your context. So no, it's completely optional, and even a submission that focused on a few features of excellence would be fine and would be helpful. Different story for the provider, who, you know, we've got more expectation. If there are gaps missing, it's harder to assess against both aspects. But there's not the same kind of strict, rigid responsibility on students to try and cover everything.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. And like I said, we have got the student drop-in sessions, so we can pick up some of this kind of detail in those sessions as well when it comes to individual submissions or providers. Okay, brilliant. This is going to be the final question. I may direct it to Graham. So where can we find out more information about fees and the funding implications of TEF?
Yes, thanks. I did mention that briefly earlier, but there is some information in the guidance in the participation section, which kind of summarizes the fee implications, and then it does link through to, on our website, further detail of exactly what the fee limits are for each category, with or without TEF awards.
Great. Thanks, Graham. Yeah, they were all really, really interesting questions. I hope I conveyed them correctly across on behalf of our delegates who've taken the time to post those to us. So thank you so much. And Graham, I'm going to close the Q&A session and hand over to you.
Great, thanks. So don't disappear just yet, just a minute or two to go. If we could have the slides back on, thank you. And then the next slide. So just to wrap up and to reiterate, there's plenty of information on our website. The drop-in sessions, we're really looking forward to. I hope in those sessions we'll have more sort of face-to-face, not face-to-face, but, you know, we'll see each other on the screen and be able to deal with questions and have discussion. You'll be emailed the details if you're a TEF contact or a student contact. I would just like at this final stage just to gauge your level of interest in these drop-in sessions. I'm going to ask Dawn to put on a poll on the screen and give you half a minute to respond about whether you would like to come to a drop-in session and whether you've got particular themes that you'd be interested in discussing. And this is just for us to work out, you know, we've planned 4 sessions so far. We might well add more depending on demand. So just give you a little bit more time just to answer those 2 questions, if you don't mind. Okay, if we could see the results of that poll. No surprises there, lots of demand to come to those sessions and a real mix of broad themes. I'm sure there are other topics as well you'd like to cover. That's really helpful. We'll take that information away and we will email you invitations shortly. And if we could just move on to the very final slide, which is a big thank you to everybody for taking the time to come along and listen. We will publish this briefing on the OFS website, so if you missed it or didn't catch all of it, it's there for anybody to see. Thank you very much and look forward to seeing many of you in the drop-in sessions. Thank you. Goodbye.